I want to thank Chevron Ornite for sponsoring today's virtual town hall. And in fact, they just recently signed an agreement to sponsor all of our town halls going forward into 2021. So that's very exciting. I really appreciate their support. My name is Holly Alfano. I'm the CEO of ILMA, and I will be moderating this panel. I want to encourage all of the attendees, all of you out there listening, to use the Q&A function to submit any questions you want to ask to the panel. Remember, this is supposed to be an Ask ILMA panel. Bring your questions to ILMA. Now, we have a few questions prepared for the panelists, but we really want to hear from you. So if you have a burning question, now is your time, because we have a group of experts who are going to be able to address anything you might ask. First of all, I'd like to introduce Gina Harm. Gina is the president of Afton Chemical Corporation. Gina, give everyone a wave so they know who you are. Beginning her distinguished career with Stone and Webster Engineering, then Exxon Chemical Americas, and also GE Plastics, Gina joined Afton in 2007 as the engine oils business manager in Richmond, Virginia. She moved to the position of vice president in 2011, then to vice president of supply in 2015. She was named senior vice president and CEO in 2015 and appointed COO, and appointed president in 2018. Jim Eggenschweiler is the director of global trade for Trinity Consultants Company. As an international trade and regulatory attorney, Jim has spent more than 30 years helping clients expand and protect their stake in global markets. Half of that time has included building and directing in-country operations in Asia and South America. Jim is a very frequent contributor to ILMA's magazine Compoundings and serves as a consultant to ILMA's Global Affairs and Trade Committee. Luke Gerard is president of Sanjuro Consulting, based in Canada, and is a consultant for ILMA's signature testing program. Jeff Leiter is ILMA's general counsel and has been with the association for nearly 40 years. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to kick things off, and I'm going to hope, so far we have 0 questions from members, so I'm going to hope that that changes soon. First of all, I'm going to start with Gina. Gina, there's been a lot of attention focused on COVID-19 and there's a long-term impact on the economy and ultimately on finished lubricant demand. How do you and your colleagues at Afton see lubricant demand shaping up for 2021?
Well, thanks, Holly. Thanks for the question. And thanks for the opportunity to participate today with the other town hall discussion participants. You know, certainly COVID has been an interesting time, I think, for all of us. And, you know, from a finished lubricant demand standpoint, I think we collectively saw significant impact in the second quarter when the whole country was essentially in a lockdown period. And I think the trends that we're all trying to get our arms around is how is, you know, kind of the lower commuting because of the rise of remote work. What's that influence going to be relative to maybe how people are avoiding public transportation because they're trying to protect themselves? Certainly also without flying around, you know, a lot of us are spending a lot more time is in our vehicles, you know, going on holiday or vacation. So, you know, since that low point of second quarter, I would say I think the market has rebounded very quickly, and it's been more like a V-shaped recovery, and certainly expect the end of the year to stay strong as long as we avoid another lockdown period. I think the other thing that we've been spending a lot of time talking about with our customers is another thing to be cognizant of is just without people flying and the lower jet fuel demand, you know, certainly refinery operations are kind of upside down right now with what products they're being asked to make. And so I think it's important for us all to take a look at, potential longer term effects on, bright stock and base oils, and make sure that we're conscious of that, again, as this pandemic continues and the different behaviors continue in the market. So, kind of right now, I think what's important for all of us is to just make sure that we're spending a lot of time talking to each other about supply demand dynamics, that we're taking time to really do dynamic forecasting and kind of, reviewing that regularly. And then certainly taking a look at all of our supply contracts to make sure that we have, strong security of supply in these dynamic times.
Great. So in the last several years, when you talk about COVID, there were supply disruptions that occurred in the marketplace, or logistics challenges related to that. And in the last several years, the industry's had a few major supply disruptions that have caused some challenges for lubricant blenders. What has Afton done to maintain the security of supply for their customers that maybe we can all learn from?
Well, yeah, again, thanks for the build on that question. I think the important thing from a security supply or business continuity is to build that in as early in our product development processes as possible. And again, I think that just goes across the supply chain. And take a look at making sure that you have kind of multiple options built in for those critical raw materials. And that's certainly something that we've done here is, incorporated that into our product development cycle. Kind of the obvious things are always to look at inventory levels, and we look at building out our manufacturing network, both within the Americas and globally, as another way to build in some resilience in the supply chain. But I think it goes back to what I already said a few minutes ago. The more you can talk with customers and suppliers and work together to ensure our needs are met, that'll put all of us in a better position to support each other.
Okay. I'm just checking questions. Let's see. Throwing this out to the panelists, and there may be a couple of you who can comment on this, but if there's a second round of lockdowns, and let's hope that doesn't happen, what have you learned from the first one that you'll be implementing in your business?
Does anybody else want to jump in? I'm happy to comment.
Go ahead.
I think what we've reflected on through the lockdowns, first of all, is take time to go beyond the headlines. I think one of the things that's been challenging through the whole situation is, if you stop at the headline, you would think that we should all have stopped living and conducting business. And certainly, I think even though there was quote unquote lockdowns, especially us in this industry, being part of essential services and the essential business, it was kind of all of our responsibility to continue to operate and to do it safely. And I think it's been actually a benefit being in our industry and in the chemical industry, where safety is kind of a core competency, and it's something that we all do day in, day out. And we've just had to kind of extend that part of how we operate to dealing with the pandemic. So the lessons that we've talked about is, like I said, go beyond the headlines, the second part is just continue to recognize just how personal this situation has been, because I think it's affected everybody differently based on your personal family situations. And that's been an important learning, is to make sure that part of how we're leading and managing continues through this. So be a little more human maybe than, historical in business.
Okay. Before we leave the subject of COVID, Jeff, can you update us on what the employer's obligations are under OSHA regulations to report workplace incidents of COVID-19 exposure?
Well, sure, and I think tying into the last question and some of what Gina said, in talking with a number of ILMA members, everyone had contingency plans. Very few, if any, had this as a contingency, the pandemic and the kind of responses that were needed. And leading into answering your question, Holly, I think the other piece is, in terms of lessons learned, is that the CDC and OSHA guidance has changed. State and local requirements have changed. And so getting into a possible second lockdown, or as Vice President Biden talked about, a dark winter, it's just really staying on top of so many of these changes and how to be flexible and moving quickly in terms of addressing the employee concerns. So turning to the specific question about the OSHA reporting requirements, when I was in law school, I had a professor who was very big on the 3 R's: read the rule, read the rule, read the rule. So if we start with the OSHA regulation at 29 CFR 1904.39, all employers, regardless of size, have an obligation to contact OSHA within 8 hours if an employee were to die, or 24 hours with an in-hospitalization, both instances tied to a workplace injury or occurrence. Historically, most, if not all, infectious diseases have not been recordable or reportable in terms of common cold, the flu. Just the community spread type issue. But then once the COVID-19 pandemic broke out on April 13th, OSHA said that some COVID-19 cases would be reportable and recordable. They initially started out with healthcare. And then in May, OSHA changed its tune to say all employers needed to assess whether to record and report COVID reportable cases. Then in July, you follow me now, they're starting to keep on changing. OSHA said and put out some guidance that was extremely broad and likely unenforceable from the lawyer's perspective in terms of what OSHA saw as the employer's responsibility. Basically, at that point in July, saying regardless of whether it was a work-related illness, that there would be some obligation to record and report. That approach in July was quickly deleted from their website a few weeks later. Now on October 1st, and we just reported this in the ILMA news, OSHA issued these new frequently asked questions about work-related incidents. They now tie it to exposure to COVID-19 in the workplace, which is good. But keep in mind that a couple of things. One, that the frequently asked question, the guidance, is not subject to notice and comment rulemaking. It differs from the enforcement side. So that's number one. Number two, there's 28 states that have approved OSHA plans. Currently, California, New Mexico, and Virginia have distinct reporting requirements. So if I wrap this all up and say, what does an ILMA member do? I think there's 5 things. First is, stay on top of the reporting requirements, both to the federal OSHA and the state equivalents. Secondly, regardless of what OSHA, either at the federal or state level, requires, there may be state or local health department reporting requirements in terms of positive COVID cases in the workplace. A third is, what obligation do you have to tell your employees about positive cases in the workplace? And then lastly would be third parties. All of these occur within strict timelines. Lastly, in terms of how to manage all that, again, is this written plan to manage COVID cases and making sure, particularly with the supervisory levels, that folks are on the same page in terms of how to manage COVID-19 cases if and when they might occur in your particular workplaces. So I know it's a long long answer, Holly. It's bounced around with OSHA, but I think there are those key elements for everyone to keep in mind.
Okay, great. We just last week, we've had a membership that's always been still interested in international trade, and that's why we have Jim here. And I did get a question from a member. He said he was going to be here to raise it. I don't see it yet in the queue, but it had to do with Brexit, and it was talking about their eventual development of REACH regulations specific to the UK. And Jim, I know that Brexit has stalled a little bit. First of all, can you tell me a little bit about where that is? Oh, Jim, we lost your microphone. Unmute.
Sorry, I had to unmute, so
Okay.
I had to find it. Your question, Holly, are you asking about, or is the member asking about the chemical regulatory aspect of the UK in that question, or is it a more general question?
Well, I mean, I think first a good starter is where is Brexit? Because it was supposed to happen over and over again, and it hasn't. That would be question one. And question two is, at some point, the assumption is that this person had was that they were going to develop their own set of chemical regulations. Is that true? And what would be the timing on that, and so on?
Yeah. Okay. And thank you for that question. It's really pertinent, and it's really just becoming newsworthy again, in that for the longest time, things have been dormant in terms of no change. There's been communication in the background, but the EU and the UK have been keeping one another at arm's length. They've been stalwart on the issues. They haven't been willing to budge much. And it's coming down to the point where now the parties are recognizing there's a very limited time left, and they need to start making whatever they can make. And they've been doing that since, I would say, since the 1st of August in earnest. But the catch is the details. Fundamentally, Brexit is stalled right now because the EU and the UK are having a difficult time getting into the issues that the UK sees as sovereignty issues. So the UK wants to have a relationship. They keep saying they want a relationship similar to what Canada has with the EU. And the EU wants to have more control and more reliance upon the EU and commonality, including waterways, for instance. And so many of the remaining things, like chemical regulations and European REACH, are, at this point, it sounds as if the EU would go to a no-deal exit then before they would agree to participate in the European REACH regulation, because to them that would be a dismissal of their sovereignty. They would be sacrificing their sovereignty, and that's true of all of the remaining issues that I'm aware of. They're all sovereignty-oriented issues, and even small ones. Seemingly small ones, getting all the way down to territorial waters and control over the fishing industry in territorial waters. It's not a very big economic segment for them, but it's symbolic and a really important key to understanding where things are right now with Brexit.
Okay.
So the UK will start its own chemical registration process of some type. There's just no question about that in my mind.
And what would the timing on that be? I mean, I guess they've got any idea?
That's a good question. To my knowledge, they made a lot of progress in developing a regulatory structure.
Okay.
Now, some speculate that they will fundamentally create their own version, European Reach, and call it something different, and might not be identical, but it'll be substantially similar,
Okay.
like some other jurisdictions have been. There's also some thought that they're going to take their time and perhaps grandfather certain substances, almost create something analogous to a TSCA inventory.
Okay.
And essentially those registered substances based upon EU registrations will be considered market eligible for a period of time while they develop their own system.
Okay.
Will convert and everyone will have to comply.
Great. Okay. I'm having a little freezing issue here, but I think okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Gina, getting back to you, and I'm picking on you a lot today, but that when we were talking about the UK, it kind of reminded me of their ban on in the internal combustion engine and the European approach to also doing the same in a number of areas. And then that reminded me again of the California move to do the same thing by 2035. What insight do you have on, and I'm going to ask everyone to please, if you're not talking, to mute your mics. We're getting some feedback. Sorry. What insight do you have on to share with us about the impact on finished lubricant demand once we transition away from the ICE?
Yeah, thanks again, Holly. I think certainly, I think similar to the COVID headlines right now, electric vehicles are certainly getting more than their share of headlines. And like you mentioned, this now there's some potential state action. You mentioned the California state action. I think there was, I don't know if it was New Jersey last week, may have mentioned something quite similar as some pending legislation. And so, yes, there's that movement out there to kind of push us all towards electric vehicles. But I think the great news for all of us in our industry is that what's not in the headlines is the installed base of the internal combustion engines and just how prevalent that's going to remain. And certainly the average age of the fleet now, and it's 12, kind of fast approaching 13 years. So even as EVs get kind of even legislated into new vehicle buy, it's going to take a long time to turn over that base. So, our view is that the demand for our products and for everyone's products in this industry are going to continue decades into the future and be quite an important part of the solution for emissions reduction and improved fuel economy. The one thing I would say is if your finished lubes business is driveline oriented, then maybe the electric vehicle conversation is a bit more near-term impactful and certainly represents a big opportunity for you. As these lubricants are being developed specific for EVs. So it's going to be an exciting time for everybody in this industry for many years.
Okay. Following up on, I don't know if you were in the previous session where a couple of things were talked about having to do with sustainability and renewable lubricants and fluids. And a question in the queue is following up on the previous speaker. Do you see a market shift where customers will start demanding more sustainable, renewable lubricants and fluids?
Yeah, from our perspective, absolutely. Sustainability, environmental, yes, social governance issues are certainly at the forefront. I think it's something that all of us are going to need to address, and certainly it can be an opportunity in the industry. It's important not only for our customers, but I think it's also becoming more and more important for our employees as well. And if you're a publicly traded organization, it's critically important to have a focus on sustainability.
Okay. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Nope. I have another question from the queue. And again, Gina, you might be on the hook with this one too. What has driven up the cost of gear oil additives in the past 2 years?
Well, I think because this is an industry session, I'm not specifically going to address any specific pricing related questions. But, I think the things that influence all of us, certainly supply demand are things to be that influence cost structures. I think what Jim talked about earlier from a regulatory standpoint can influence the cost structure of what's going on. So I think those factors all come into play when you look at potential cost influences in the industry.
Yeah, and again, we would never ask anyone to discuss price and especially forward going. I think what he was referring to is, are there some, other than market forces, are there any issue with product supply or something like that that would have had an impact that you're aware of, Gina? No. Okay.
No, I don't have anything to build on what I shared.
Okay. Let's see, I've got another one here. Are there long-term liability issues coming in the future from those employees getting COVID at work? Or is there legislative I think what this questioner is asking, what this member wants to know, has got to do with essential business liability protection. Jeff, if you could turn your microphone and your camera on.
Oops, my camera's on.
Okay, well, we're seeing your picture, but we can hear you. So what is the status of the essential businesses? I know that on Capitol Hill, they have been trying to get liability protection passed, and it's been kind of caught up in the wrangling between the Democrats and the Republicans on COVID relief. What is the status of that now?
Well, a couple things. I mean, right now, in terms of the legislative piece to it, there are negotiations going on between the Trump administration, led largely by the Secretary of Treasury, Mnuchin, and Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Depending on who you listen to, those negotiations are, down to some short issues. One of the things on the table as part of those negotiations is liability protection for essential businesses that remained open throughout the pandemic. There are different versions of legislation floating around Capitol Hill. The House actually did pass some protection in May. However, it tied those liability protections to a number of factors that put limits on the protection in terms of dollar amounts and qualifications. There's bipartisan legislation in the Senate that essentially would, as long as you followed OSHA guidelines, and again, emphasize guidelines, that you had liability protection. Whether this gets through the Congress or not at this point remains to be seen. The key issue is whether the Speaker wants to hand Donald Trump a win before the election on some of the key components of that legislation. At the same time, a number of states, and the last time I counted it, it was around 20, had passed some form of liability protection. Some of it was limited to colleges and universities, healthcare workers, but the state's been trying to address liability protection as well in those particular states. Broadly, and again, I don't want to go on too long, but the issue with an employee who says he or she contracted COVID in the workplace creates two issues. One is whether that claim goes under the state workers' comp law. And again, a number of states have, either by legislation or executive order, said that COVID-related diseases, again, communicable, are being covered by workers' comp. So it's a state-driven workers' comp issue. The other side is whether there's some tort claim, whether there was a breach, you had a standard of care, you didn't follow it. Where these cases started coming was in the cruise ship industry, and as well with some of the bigger companies like Walmart and Amazon.
Okay.
But you got a causation issue there, and that's where our advice again becomes: if you follow the best you can the CDC and OSHA guidelines, your chances of somebody proving that they got it at your place of work becomes greatly diminished.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting to get more questions now from members. And another question, this question is for Luke Gerard. What is the current issue related to the definition of base stock manufacturer that is currently being debated by API?
Thanks a lot, Glenn. But actually, this is one of the questions I planted for myself, more or less. Base stock manufacturers, well, first of all, it's been pretty contentious within the API lubricants group. I believe this is the third round in trying to get a motion and a ballot that will pass. The fundamental question is, at what point does manufacturing begin in the realm of base stocks? One API member is quite concerned that the idea of just blending base stocks to sell them does not constitute manufacturing. The latest proposal basically focuses on the idea that if you want to call yourself a base stock manufacturer, you have to do some kind of chemistry. You have to actually alter molecules at some point in your process, whether that's through hydrogenation or isomerization, oligomerization, polymerization, condensation, etc. You have to do some sort of chemistry to be a base stock manufacturer, according to this proposal. One concern that raises is, in one of the phrasings proposed for these ballots, you could infer that blending alone in any context did not constitute manufacturing. Well, in our industry, we do an awful lot of blending before we can do any selling. And, I know Holly and the management are big proponents of flying into NAM, the National Alliance of Manufacturers, I believe is the acronym. So, most of you consider yourselves manufacturers. So the idea that blending is not manufacturing is very contentious for a number of API members. Mm-hmm. So we are on what I believe is the third iteration of this debate. On the bright side, look at it this way: the API groups are not at issue. So if you're a historic consumer of Group 1 or Group 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, those aren't being looked at. They are still immune to discussion. I would advise those of you who do purchase, whether you think you purchase base stock or base oil, you might want to have a chat with your current suppliers and see how they feel about it. But it's, again, there's a ballot still running now, and there might be more fur flying around this one for another iteration.
And just so that people understand these ballots and this process that API goes through, is this to guide them in setting policy? What exactly, how does the lubricants group fit into the structure of API?
In the current realm, the broad concept is if you want to modify what appears in API 1509,
Mhm.
it has to be balloted.
Okay.
So this definition does not exist today, has not existed yet.
Okay.
So to have it brought into the text, it is a ballotable issue.
Okay.
And again, we're on iteration at least 3, if not 4, of this situation.
And a follow-up question along those lines, or what are the implications of whether a company is considered a base stock manufacturer or not? In other words, what does that mean for a company? Are there any consequences there?
Some of the negative ballots, or at least the negative or unsupportive comments, if you will, that have been provided are just that. Why do you need this?
Right.
Why, we've been running along fine for decades. Where's this coming from? Many people feel they haven't been given a satisfactory answer. I will give you one thing to observe. Those of you who rely on base oil interchange and viscosity read across guidelines, there is a concept in those two parts of API 1509 that refers to a base stock slate. It's not well developed. It hasn't been looked at in large groups for quite some time, but I'm concerned that this idea of having a manufacturer could impact to some extent the flexibility of base stock purchasers. I can't put my finger on it yet because, again, the concept of slate hasn't been brought to lock into this proposed ballot, but it raises my eyebrows a little bit. And again, since many ILMA members are base stock or base oil purchasers, I'm vaguely concerned it could, to some extent, limit your flexibility later.
Okay.
Luke, how does it tie into, is it interpretation? Is that the right word? Interpretations that have been done under 1509?
The 1509. So as part of the balloting process, sometimes if something gets balloted, or even if the existing text, any potential user reads it and goes, this seems to be ambiguous to me. So, dear API, can you interpret the following passage for me? And there's at least 2 of those interpretations. For those of you who are fans of API 1509, they live in Annex O. They make for riveting reading. But question 017 and 022 are relevant here. And this is where the whole thing about blending alone does not constitute manufacturing kind of arise from those 2 passages.
Okay.
And causing concern to some people who, again, are net purchasers of base oils and base stocks and are very uncomfortable about being told that blending is not manufacturing.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And, now that we're talking about some policy type discussion, I want to ask about ILMA's obsolete oil proposal. We have had that language pending at the National Conference on Weights and Measures for how long, Jeff? 4 years? Oh, look who's here.
Almost 5.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, we hear you fine.
Oh, boy. What a day.
Okay. I'm sorry you had some difficulties. But anyway, we were just talking about obsolete oil, a very fascinating subject. And that is motor oil that doesn't meet an active API specification. ILMA has been trying to get labeling requirements for some time, and it's been like moving the earth, working within the National Conference on Weights and Measures. Jeff, what's the status of that? It's a voting item, I understand. Can you give us a brief update?
Sure, Holly. The obsolete oil proposal.
When would it be effective is my question.
Yeah. I mean, the obsolete oil proposal was supposed to be voted on by the Weights and Measures group last July at their annual meeting, which got continued until this January because of the pandemic. The proposal is pretty well developed at this point. The key element is twofold. One, to make it illegal under the uniform laws to misrepresent viscosity, API service classification, CS spec, or an OEM spec. The other piece is, to the extent that an oil is deemed obsolete, either under SAJ 183, API 1509, or by an OEM, it would require a cautionary statement on the front-facing or forward label of the product. This is to overcome some of the issues that have been raised in the various class action lawsuits that have been brought against several of the manufacturers, as well as against Dollar General. So we're hoping that in January, the full weights and measures group will go ahead and approve the proposal. API did raise with ILMA in the last week an issue with respect to if an OEM declares it obsolete but doesn't issue a cautionary statement, what does a lubricant manufacturer do with that particular situation? There was a sentence that was being struck from the proposal, and we've told the weights and measures group we think probably just to leave that in makes sense. So there may be an editorial change coming between now and January, but the proposal is fully developed. We're just waiting for it to be adopted. And while mentioning it,
And when would it be effective, Jeff? Did I miss that?
I'm sorry?
When would it be effective if we're adopted?
Oh, but if it would be effective, it would take, right now, the current plan would be for it to be effective January 1st of 2021.
But if they vote on it in January, that would probably have to be changed, right?
Well, excuse me, January 2022. I got the dates wrong.
2022, okay.
Yeah, 2022.
Okay, thank you. Since Steve is here, Steve, welcome. Steve's with Chevron Ornite, and they're the sponsors of this, and thank you very much. We thank you quite a bit when you were not here, just to let you know that we're missing you.
Apologize, I missed that, so I'm sorry.
I'm going to ask you a question since we've been picking on everybody else. What's the latest with GM, and this is one I get asked, we get asked a lot, with GM Dexos 1 Gen 3 specification?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. If you recall our town hall, I think it was early August, we had the pleasure of having Nathan Siebert join us, and he outlined a timeline at that time. And the timeline was that tests were to be released on September 1st of this year. And 1 year later, first license would be available for Dexos 1 Gen 3. That'd be September 1st, 2021. And that's where we are. That's the timing that we're still on.
Okay.
So testing has begun. The new tests, in a way, they are available. They became available September 1st, or in September, let's just say. So the new critical tests that I'm talking about are GM's LSPI test. They call it GM SPI, stochastic pre-ignition. It came available, it went offline, and it's back available at Intertech. The one thing about that test, however, is that GM has not determined the pass-fail criteria. They're still collecting data. So you can run, but they're still assessing where they are in terms of whether an oil is a pass or a fail. So there's still some work on the GM SPI. And if, just to be clear, on Gen 3, GM moving from Gen 2 to Gen 3, they're looking to improve SPI performance. They're also looking to improve fuel economy performance. So there's a new fuel economy test that also came available in September. It's called the GMOEE, GM Oil Efficiency Evaluation Test. It uses a 5-liter V8 Silverado engine, so much different than the previous 4-cylinder test that was run. It is available, and technology and data is coming out from that in terms of how that does separate oils. So that's available. There is a test that's not available yet. It's the high temperature MTM wear test. It is not available. you can run it, but the procedure for measurement is not defined, nor are the limits. So that won't be ready until the end of the year. So there's, a mixed bag. You can run most of the tests. Some of the limits are not defined. One test still not available. So they haven't changed timing. It's still the target of September 1st, 2021 for first license. But I see some challenges there. There's bottlenecks in some of the tests, but that's the status. So tests are being run right now against that specification.
Thank you. Now I have a question. I'm going to throw it out there to the group, and it is from one of our members. What additive compounds do you think would be under scrutiny on the push to sustainability?
I would propose that just to get some discussion going here. Certainly, the metal content, maybe something in terms of some of the anti-wear components that use metal content. There's nothing specific at this point, but probably would be more along the lines of zinc dithylphosphates and things of that nature. But I do see them still being a useful and efficient approach for anti-wear componentry. But I think when we start looking at componentry, there might be something more around the metal contents of the lubricants and trying to drive downward on ash level, things of that nature.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, just say we can all probably look to reach for the classes of chemistry that continue to be scrutinized. I think, just reaffirming what Steve shared. That is certainly a focus area, but again, the utility of all of our products remain quite valid. And, I think we just have to deal with the regulatory environment because there's not really other solutions out there. So it's just going to be understanding the chemistry and then ensuring that we're aligned with what the regulatory requirements are.
Okay, I'm gonna shoot Jim a question because he's been over there kind of quiet, so give everyone else a little rest. And this is a good question because a lot of members are very interested in expanding into South American markets. And if a company is looking to begin exporting to companies in South America, what should they prepare in terms of regulations affecting chemical product imports?
Well, I want to make sure my microphone is on. I would say that there's obviously in a growing number of South American countries, there's a lot of adoption of GHS and labeling requirements that even go beyond GHS. In some jurisdictions, they have their own types of product labeling that extend beyond what would be typical. The more the country is acclimating to global standards and to GHS, then you'll see that appear. So determining what type of what category, if you will, from a regulatory standpoint, what category of country that you want to target for your intervention, I think that's an important consideration. But probably a greater consideration is the growing number of South American countries that are adopting chemical substance type registration systems that are not uniform. Some are modeling after a hybrid, in fact, between the Canadian system and European REACH, or in some cases, US TSCA, which is a little different structurally than the Canadian system, though they live similarly, and European REACH. Getting into these hybrids becomes tricky, and I guess the consideration that you have first off the cost factor. What used to be a much less expensive entry to ship product into an international market in South America didn't take these kinds of considerations just a few years ago, but that's changed rapidly, and some of the countries are pairing up, or they're following organizational lines in South America, so that some are aligning more with a Brazilian structure, others are going completely independent. And sifting through that and preparing for that well enough in advance of your intent to launch is going to be really important. I see too many clients that overlook that, not specifically, not only with South America, but it includes South America, and highlighted by that jurisdiction. They wait until their sales efforts are mature enough to actually have customers that are ready to import, and that's when they end up tripping over that question or that issue, just because it's not the kind of issue you want to deal with that rapidly. You can't deal with it that rapidly. It takes, this is not a type of issue where you can, in most of these jurisdictions, you can no longer get something satisfied within a matter of weeks. You're talking about a matter of months, whether it's 2 or 3 months or 7 to 9 months, depends on how mature the regulations are and how much you're having to wait for maturity of the agency that's controlling it. There's a lot of different factors that come into play that don't necessarily come into play in Europe or in the US or Canada, but you also have a repeat of those issues as well. So I would say the biggest issue is making sure that you're in tune with what the regulatory environment is from a chemical substance and chemical product standpoint.
Okay, thank you. That was a good one, a good question, a good answer. Appreciate that. So I have a question from a member, and it is, what does supply security mean as it pertains to manufacturing capacity, specifically when using third-party manufacturing?
Is Steve answering all the questions?
I could add a few comments. I think, there was an interesting comment that Brenda Gillinson made in the introductory introductory little session that she put for the ILMA, and she used the word pivot. Pivot was a significant word we've heard recently. I think supply security with third party, I think it's an integral part of maintaining your supply chain integrity, and I think it's just having that flexibility, building that flexibility in to make sure you defend and be able to supply your customers. I think that communication and developing that relationship on third parties is just as integral as part of your manufacturing. I'm not sure if I necessarily answered the question, but I just think it's a key aspect in communicating and making sure that you have a sound security of supply relationship, even if it's a third-party supplier.
Anyone else want to comment?
I was just going to add, Holly, in terms of discussions with a number of members, besides, just let's say the physical assets of product is the cybersecurity piece, and issues with ransomware and some of the other problems going on with cybersecurity. Certainly I would commend folks to ILMA's cybersecurity toolkit.
Sure. Luke, a couple questions for you.
Okay.
You are the consultant to ILMA's ethics committee, and as we all know, all of our members sign an agreement to abide by our code of ethics and to participate in our testing program. And you work with our ethics committee to administer the program. Can you talk about whether the ethics committee is taking on specific activities as an outcome of GF6 implementation?
Basically one that unfortunately is still pending, and the pandemic and difficulty with meetings hasn't helped with that. But the key one is the testing profiles that we use for engine oil were developed for SM. So, a decade and a half ago. We've made adjustments, especially when Dexos Gen 2 came out and had its own LSPR or SPI, as Steve mentioned earlier. We had to mentally adjust that we were going to start seeing an awful lot more magnesium in passenger car engine oils than we did before. The testing profiles, of course, I'm not going to tell you everything that's in them because I don't want you to be able to fake your way around them, haha. But it's a combination of physicals, chemicals, and tribological properties. The question is, we've had 2.5 iterations. We've had SN plus, we've had GF6. The Dexos in the background as well has evolved. So is our current profile still the best? I think it's still definitely adequate, but we're trying to get together a group. Well, we've nominated people to a group. They've agreed to participate, but getting us all together has been problematic so far.
Yep.
But yes, we definitely plan to modernize the testing profile for engine oil.
Okay, great. And what about tractor hydraulic fluids? Are there any actions taking place related to that?
There might need to be a little reinvestigation if we get ASTM Hydraulics Subcommittee N to create a specification of sorts for what we now consider to be obsolete tractor specs. But today, the profile we have is pretty darn solid given the constraints we work under.
Just to kind of, Jeff, would you mind bringing everyone up to speed on, one of the other issues kind of hanging before NCWM, I mentioned before, National Conference on Weights and Measures, is the issue related to obsolete tractor hydraulic fluid. And again, another labeling issue that ILMA has advocated for. What's the status of that, Jeff?
Yeah, so Weights and Measures, the National Conference of Weights and Measures in 2019 adopted tractor hydraulic fluid amendments that specifically required obsolete tractor fluids to have a front-facing cautionary statement. There were a handful of problems ILMA saw with what we thought was a rushed amendment at that point. So ILMA proposed two things. One was a placeholder for the ASTM specification being developed by that subcommittee N. The second was the labeling requirement was for clearly legible without much beyond what that meant. We polled a number of member companies, and by default, they use hazardous substance labeling requirements in the Code of Federal Regulations. So ILMA proposed the second piece as to default to those font and size standards as set forth in the 1 CFR section. In January of this past year, the Weights and Measures folks had their interim meeting. They said, we really don't like to put placeholders in our standards. So they rejected the placeholder for the subcommittee N work. They did, however, proceed to approve the labeling requirement for the default to the Federal Code of Regulations. That proposal is also set for a final vote by the National Conference when it has its continued annual meeting in January, and if approved at that point would become effective January 1st of 2022.
Okay, great. Well, we've asked and answered almost all the questions here, and I'm going to close with one final question for Jeff, and this is kind of a semi-fun question because it's a political issue that a lot of the members have had to deal with, and this year's had its share of challenges. The presidential election is a week away. Tensions are strained, shall we say? Mm-hmm. And how do employers cope with employees wanting to bring political conduct into the workplace, and so on. What can employers, how can employers manage that?
Well, it's a careful balancing act with employees wanting to wear a MAGA face mask, to wearing buttons, to, certainly with social distancing in the break rooms where there's arguments that break out over political candidates. Let me answer it this way. I mean, first, as a general proposition, the First Amendment to our Constitution, which guarantees a right to freedom of speech, does not apply to private sector employees or employers. However, let me put the however in. There's a handful of states, notably California, Connecticut, New York, that have enacted freedom of speech protections for employees in the workplace, provided that it doesn't interfere with their ability to perform their job. It's not a safety issue. But then taking it down to the next level, you have the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA, which is administered by the National Labor Relations Board. It does protect concerted activities by employees. So it can apply if, let's say, the employee's political speech is related to work conditions at the facility. But there's no clear test in terms of what does concerted activity in terms of political speech mean. The NLRB's General Counsel has some guidance that employers may enforce otherwise offensive political speech as long as it's neutrally applied to work rules. So it kind of leaves it up to a case-by-case basis. Importantly, though, there are a number of civil rights and anti-discrimination laws that may be implicated by the speech. So if you get into gender, sex, religion, disabilities, those things could have an effect. So here's what generally I tell folks to be conscious of. What's the federal and state laws? Is there something in my particular state that would put some restrictions on what I may or may not do with employees? It's certainly okay for an employer to put in place policies for non-work related political speech and expression. Keep in mind that doesn't necessarily include using Facebook and what employees might do in their off hours in terms of trying to be influencers on social media. It's also possible and allowable to have dress code policies that deal with masks, buttons, masks, and things like that. Typically, to the extent that it affects job performance, then I think it's allowable. But it's a tough balancing act, and certainly in this particular season, it's been tough for ILMA members as employers to manage that along with all the COVID-related issues.
Okay, I got one more question, and the answer has to be pretty quick. So, and it is, first of all, quickly defining, I think we already covered what the ILMA proposal for THF, and it actually didn't originate from ILMA. It came from the weights and measures regulators put forth the THF, the tractor hydraulic fluid proposal, which we just gave input to. But we covered it pretty well. It's a labeling requirement, and it's requiring labeling on the front of the container. So that is that. And any updates on the labeling of ATFs?
Yes, the short answer is yes. So you've got the obsolete oil, and then you've got the tractor hydraulic fluid labeling. Our friends from the Missouri Weights and Measures think that, well, you need to have similar kind of cautionary statements for automatic transmission fluids. So they put a proposal through that's working its way through the 4 regional associations. Actually, while we've been having our discussions today, the Central Weights and Measures Association Law and Regulations Committee is meeting. ILMA submitted a written letter to the Central Weights and Measures Group last night that said we have some concerns, particularly as it applies to multi-vehicle fluids. If you read the proposed language strictly, it says any claims to meet. And most multi-vehicle fluids don't claim to actually meet a particular specification, but say suitable for use. So arguably, all multi-vehicle fluids might need a cautionary statement. We've suggested that it needs more discussion among stakeholders, OEMs, the additive companies, ILMA members as fluid manufacturers, installers, and such.
What is the status of that? Is it developing, voting, informational? Do you know?
Yeah, so the Northeastern Weights and Measures Association 2 weeks ago reported it as a developing item. It needs
Okay.
more work. We've asked the central folks to keep it as a developing item as well.
So that means it's got a pretty long way to go in the process, at least a year, if not more. So
Yeah.
that, for all you people out there that aren't familiar with that.
Arguably, that would be the case. Although Ron Hayes is a good guy from Missouri.
Yeah, fast track stuff.
He likes the fast track thing. So
yeah, well, we'll see. Okay, well, thank you all of you for your participation. This was fun. We got a lot of good questions, and thanks for jumping in and answering. I'm sorry that Steve, you didn't get to be with us the whole time, but
Me too.
I'm thanking everybody, Jim. So I want to thank all the ILMA members for joining us and for this whole virtual experience. It's been a lot of fun. We'll see you a little bit later.
Thank you, Holly.